The messenger arrived before dawn. No one knew what to make of him. He was covered in dust, the kind that accumulates over days, not hours. His horse had died somewhere north of the city. He had walked the last stretch on foot. The guards almost turned him away. They didn't. What he said in the next few minutes would change the shape of the ancient world. Rome had lost armies before. That wasn't unusual. War was expensive, messy, and unpredictable. Commanders made mistakes. Soldiers died. The Senate grieved, reorganized, and sent more legions. That was the Roman system. That was why it worked. But this was different. The reports coming in from the north weren't reports of a battle lost. They were reports of a battle that couldn't be explained. 2 Roman armies, not 1, 2, had been intercepted in territory Rome considered safe. The commanders were experienced men, trained in the Roman way. They had done everything correctly, and they had been destroyed. Not just defeated, destroyed. The Senate chamber went quiet in a way it rarely did. These were men who had seen political crisis, men who had argued through military disasters, men who knew how to project calm when the situation demanded it. But this morning, in the early hours, reading the reports from the north, they sat still. The structure Rome relied on, the idea that numbers and discipline and training would always prevail, had just been tested. Not by a rival power, not by a massive empire, by a force that had no supply lines, no reinforcements, no siege equipment, no support from any state. A force that had crossed mountains to get there, a force that had no right to be in Italy at all. And yet, here it was. Here they were. If you enjoy deep historical documentaries, consider subscribing. There's a lot more where this is coming from. Word began to spread through the city before the Senate could control it. That's what made it worse. In Rome, information moved through the streets faster than any official declaration. By the time the sun was fully up, people were gathering at corners, outside temples, near the markets. The news had a texture to it that ordinary military defeats didn't have. It felt different. It felt closer. Mothers pulled their children inside. Merchants locked up early. The roads leading south out of the city, not toward the fighting, but away from it, began to fill. This was fear in its most honest form. Not panic, not yet. But the beginning of something Rome had almost never experienced. Genuine, structural uncertainty about whether its military superiority was real. The Senate tried to reassure people. They announced emergency measures. They called for sacrifice and discipline. They reminded citizens of all the times Rome had faced crisis and prevailed. They invoked the traditions of the ancestors, the strength of Roman institutions, the favor of the gods. It helped a little, temporarily. But the fear had taken root because the situation was genuinely unprecedented. A foreign commander had walked an army across the Alps in winter, descended into northern Italy, and within months dismantled the finest military forces Rome had available. He had done it without a navy, without a home base, without a clear plan for what came after. He had done it through something harder to legislate against than numbers. He had done it through thinking. The Senate asked for a complete report. They wanted to understand the terrain, the troop positions, the tactical errors. They were still trying to find the mistake, the specific failure that had allowed this to happen, the reassuring explanation, the thing they could fix. There wasn't one. That was the answer the reports kept returning to. No catastrophic mistake, no betrayal, no equipment failure, no unusual terrain disadvantage. The Roman commanders had simply encountered a mind they weren't prepared for. His name was Hannibal. His name came before him by years. In Carthage, military reputation wasn't just a matter of pride. It was currency. It was survival. The Barcid family, Hannibal's family, had built their standing through war, and specifically through a war that had ended badly. The First Punic War concluded in 241 BC with Carthage's defeat at sea. The peace terms were punishing. Carthage lost Sicily. It lost its dominant position in the western Mediterranean. It lost the strategic leverage it had spent generations building. The defeat was expensive in every sense, in treasure, in territory, in credibility. Hamilcar Barca, Hannibal's father, had not been defeated in the field. That detail mattered to him. He had fought effectively in Sicily, held his positions, conducted a campaign that, by land-based military standards, had been successful. He had then watched his city negotiate a surrender he did not believe was necessary. He had signed documents that represented not a military conclusion, but a political one. He did not accept it as final. This is the environment Hannibal was born into. Not just a family of soldiers, but a family organized around a specific unfinished conflict. The House of Barca wasn't merely wealthy or well-connected in Carthage's complicated political structure. It was ideologically committed to the resumption of conflict with Rome. It believed that the First Punic War's conclusion was a pause, not an ending. Whether Hannibal truly swore an oath at 9 years old, the famous story of him begging to accompany his father to Iberia, and Hamilcar asking whether he hated Rome, and Hannibal swearing that he did, is something historians debate. The story appears in Roman sources, passed through multiple layers of retelling. It may be embellished. It may be symbolic rather than literal. But what it represents is accurate enough. Hannibal's entire upbringing was a form of preparation. He didn't go to the standard schools of Carthaginian aristocracy. He went to Iberia with his father. He learned strategy from campaigns, not lectures. He learned how to read terrain by marching through it. He learned the psychology of allied tribes by watching Hamilcar negotiate. Sometimes successfully, sometimes through force, always with an eye toward long-term relationships rather than short-term compliance. Hamilcar was building something in Iberia. New Carthage, what is now Cartagena, became a power center. The silver mines of the region funded a rebuilt Carthaginian military capacity. The local tribes were brought into alliance structures. A base was being established that was, in practical terms, independent of Carthage's domestic politics. Hamilcar died in battle in 228 BC, fighting in Iberia. His son-in-law Hasdrubal took command. Hasdrubal continued the project with somewhat more diplomatic emphasis. He preferred agreements to confrontations and expanded the network of alliances. He also negotiated with Rome directly in the Ebro Treaty of 226 BC, which established the river as a boundary. Rome agreed not to expand north of the Ebro. Carthage agreed not to cross it militarily. It was a managed tension. Neither side thought the other had given up. Hasdrubal was assassinated in 221 BC, killed by a Gaul with a personal grievance. The army in Iberia, without hesitation, acclaimed Hannibal as commander. He was 25 years old. What followed was not a period of consolidation or cautious administration. Hannibal moved immediately. He spent his first 2 years in Iberia securing the interior, expanding Carthaginian control over territories that hadn't been fully integrated, and building a multi-ethnic army out of Iberians, Numidians, Libyans, and Gauls. He was creating something deliberately diverse, not because he was philosophically committed to diversity, but because diverse forces, properly integrated, were tactically superior. Different fighting styles, different strengths, combined effectively. The year 219 BC brought him to Saguntum. This was the move that would trigger everything. Saguntum was a city on the eastern Iberian coast, well south of the Ebro River, technically within the Carthaginian sphere under the treaty's geographic logic. But Rome had recently established a formal alliance with Saguntum, a guest friendship relationship that gave the city a claim to Roman protection. Whether this agreement violated the Ebro Treaty's spirit was legally murky. The Romans considered it a clear signal that Saguntum was off limits. Hannibal considered it a provocation, a Roman finger inserted deliberately into Carthaginian territory. He besieged the city. It took 8 months. Rome sent diplomats to Carthage demanding Hannibal be handed over. Carthage refused. The city fell. Rome declared war. Hannibal had anticipated this. He had, in many ways, engineered it. Not because he was reckless, but because he understood something about how Carthage's war with Rome needed to be structured. A slow, grinding diplomatic conflict would favor Rome's superior political weight. A war launched on Rome's terms, at Rome's timing, in territory Rome chose, would play to Rome's strengths. He needed to choose the ground. He needed to move first, move fast, and make Rome react rather than plan. The Alps were his answer, not because they were obvious, because they weren't. Everyone who advised against it had logical reasons. Crossing the Alps in late autumn with a large army was not an accepted military option. It wasn't that Romans or Carthaginians lacked knowledge of the mountains. Traders and messengers had used the passes for generations. Armies occasionally moved through them. But not at this scale, not at this speed, not with elephants, and not as the opening move of a major war. The standard strategic assumption was that any large force moving from Iberia toward Italy would go by sea or wait for spring. The sea route was faster in good conditions. The spring Alpine route, once the passes cleared, was manageable with proper preparation. Either option gave Rome time to intercept, time to mobilize, time to prepare defensive positions in the north. Hannibal chose the option that gave Rome no time. He left Iberia in the spring of 218 BC with approximately 90,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and 37 elephants. These numbers would drop dramatically by the time he reached Italy. He knew they would. That was part of the calculation. The march from New Carthage to the Rhone River took several months. He crossed the Pyrenees, already a significant undertaking, losing soldiers who deserted rather than continue, and sending others home before they had the chance. He was deliberately trimming his force. A leaner army moved faster and required less supply. A large, slow army in the Alps would be more vulnerable, not less. At the Rhone, he encountered the first real complication. The Volcae, a Gallic tribe on the west bank, had gathered in force on the opposite bank to prevent the crossing. This was a defensive position with genuine logic. The river was wide, the current was strong, and a force crossing under hostile archery would be exposed. Hannibal solved it by not making the obvious crossing. He sent a detachment upriver in the night, several days' march, to find a usable ford. This detachment, led by Hanno, not his brother, another Hanno, crossed quietly and moved to a position above and behind the Volcae. At first light, when Hannibal's main force began demonstrating a crossing at the main ford, drawing the Volcae's attention forward, Hanno's force appeared from the rear and lit a signal fire. The Volcae broke. Some crossed the river to escape, fleeing from an enemy that was suddenly on both sides of them. Hannibal's army crossed with minimal resistance. This is worth pausing on, not because the tactical solution was particularly complex, it wasn't, but because it illustrates something consistent in Hannibal's decision-making. He rarely accepted the situation he was given. He looked for what the situation could be changed into. The enemy defending the ford was a fact. The existence of fords upriver was also a fact. The connection between those two facts, that one could be used to undermine the other, required the mental step of refusing to engage on the enemy's terms. The elephants were a separate problem. The animals were terrified of water and could not be driven across directly. Hannibal's engineers constructed large rafts on the bank, covered them with earth and vegetation so the surface felt like solid ground, then extended them out from the bank in sections. The elephants were walked onto the rafts without initially realizing they were floating. By the time the rafts were cast off, the animals were committed. Some panicked and went into the river anyway, but could stand with their heads above water in the shallower stretches and walked to shore. All of them survived. The Alps themselves began somewhere around what is now the border between France and Italy. The exact route Hannibal used remains debated by historians and geographers. The Cenis Pass, the Clapier Pass, the Mont Genèvre. Scholars have argued for all of them using different combinations of ancient sources, topographic analysis, and archaeological evidence. The question isn't entirely settled. What is settled is the general nature of what the army experienced. The lower passes were controlled by hostile Gallic mountain tribes who had lived among these rocks for generations. They knew every ledge, every narrow descent, every place where a column of soldiers would be at its most vulnerable. They didn't need to fight a pitched battle. They could roll boulders. They could appear on heights and throw javelins. They could block the path with gathered men and wait for night to push from above. Hannibal handled the first phase with a combination of intelligence and timing. He learned that the mountain tribes retreated to their hilltop towns at night, leaving the passes unguarded. He marched his force up to the dangerous narrows by day, stopped, camped conspicuously, and then moved his infantry forward in the night, taking the high ground before dawn. When the tribes returned to their positions in the morning, Hannibal's men were already above them. It didn't always work cleanly. There were ambushes in the lower valleys where the Allobroges managed to catch a section of the column in a narrow defile and kill a significant number of soldiers and pack animals. Supply losses in the Alps were severe. The elephants were a target and a difficulty throughout. The cold intensified as they climbed. Rations ran low. At the summit, wherever exactly that summit was, Hannibal reportedly stopped the army and showed them, far below, the plains of northern Italy. This moment is recorded in ancient sources, and there's no particular reason to doubt its general truth, even if the specific words attributed to Hannibal were constructed later. A general stopping an exhausted army at a mountain pass and pointing toward their objective is not a miraculous claim. It is what effective commanders do. You remind men what they're suffering for. The descent was almost worse than the climb. Fresh snowfall had covered the path, which concealed earlier ice beneath it. Soldiers lost their footing constantly. Animals slipped off ledges. In one section, a rock slide had blocked the pass completely, requiring 3 days of work, including the use of fire and vinegar to crack large rocks, a technique described by Polybius, and which modern experiments have shown to be plausible, before the column could continue. He arrived in the Po Valley of northern Italy in late autumn, 218 BC. He had started with 90,000 infantry. He had approximately 20,000 infantry remaining. His cavalry, which had suffered less, numbered around 6,000. He had roughly half his elephants. By any conventional military accounting, this opening phase was catastrophic. He had lost more than 2/3 of his ground forces before engaging Rome in a single major engagement. He pressed forward anyway, because the numbers were not actually the point. The point was that he was here, in Italy, in winter, when no Roman defensive plan had assumed it was possible, and the remaining force, 20,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry, was not average. It was the survivors of an Alps crossing. It had been selected, involuntarily but effectively, for endurance and adaptability. Rome was about to learn what that meant. The Roman commanders in the north had not been idle. Publius Cornelius Scipio, one of that year's consuls, had been sent to intercept Hannibal before the Alps crossing. He'd arrived at the Rhone just days after Hannibal departed. Realizing he couldn't catch him, Scipio sent part of his army to Iberia under his brother and turned back to Italy himself, picking up command of the legions stationed in the Po Valley. He met Hannibal's cavalry at the Ticinus River in November 218 BC. It was a reconnaissance encounter more than a full battle, probing rather than decisive. Scipio was wounded. The Romans withdrew. That withdrawal wasn't just tactical, it was informational. It told both sides something important. The Carthaginian cavalry, particularly the Numidians, was genuinely superior to Roman cavalry in this kind of open engagement. Roman infantry could hold a line. Roman cavalry couldn't dominate the flanks. This asymmetry would define the next 3 years. The Trebia River battle followed in December with a different Roman commander, Sempronius Longus, who had rushed north from Sicily. Sempronius wanted to fight. He was politically motivated. The election season was approaching. He wanted a victory to his name, and he believed the Roman legions could win in direct engagement. Hannibal obliged him. He arranged for what appeared to be a confrontation on ground of Sempronius's choosing. The Roman force crossed the icy Trebia in the early morning. Hannibal had made sure there was a reason to move fast, sending his Numidian cavalry to provoke the Roman camp at dawn, then retreating. Sempronius took the bait. He pushed his force across the freezing river without breakfast, in winter conditions. What he didn't know was that Hannibal's younger brother Mago was waiting in the riverbank vegetation with 2,000 infantry and cavalry, completely concealed. The Roman force deployed for battle. Hannibal's line held. The legions pushed. They were cold. They were hungry. They were fighting an enemy that held its shape. And then Mago's force erupted from the flanks and rear. The Roman army didn't disintegrate. That's worth noting. The center managed to punch through and escape. About 10,000 men reached the town of Placentia, but the flanks and rear were destroyed. The casualties were catastrophic. Trebia was not won through superior numbers. Hannibal's army was smaller. It was won through arrangement of terrain, manipulation of timing, and an ambush force positioned the night before. It was won through preparation that assumed how the enemy would behave, and designed a situation around that assumption. The following spring brought Lake Trasimene. Hannibal had moved south into Etruria. The new consul, Gaius Flaminius, followed. Flaminius was well known as an aggressive commander and a populist politician. He had a reputation for acting decisively and not waiting for augury or Senate deliberation to slow him down. Hannibal understood this. He left behind a deliberately conspicuous trail of devastation through Etruscan territory, burning estates, plundering villages. This was not random, it was targeted provocation. Flaminius could not politically afford to allow Roman allied territory to burn. Lake Trasimene sits in a valley in what is now Umbria. The road north ran along the lake's edge, with hills rising steeply on one side and water on the other. Hannibal positioned the main Carthaginian force at the far end of this natural channel. He placed the bulk of his army, tens of thousands of infantry and cavalry, along the hillsides and behind ridges, completely hidden. In the early morning of a foggy June day, the Roman column began to enter the defile. They never saw what hit them. The ambush unfolded from three sides simultaneously. The Roman force couldn't deploy. There was no room. They couldn't retreat. The far entrance was blocked. Within 3 hours, approximately 15,000 Roman soldiers were dead, including Flaminius himself, who died in the fighting. Another 6,000, attempting to escape through the water, were captured or drowned. It was the largest ambush in the ancient world, and it was prepared through pure geographic thinking. Read the terrain, understand the enemy's psychology, put the army where the enemy doesn't expect to find it. Subscribe here for more deep historical documentaries like this one. Rome was now in what the ancient sources call a state of genuine panic. But the Senate did something interesting. It responded not by abandoning its military strategy, but by suspending part of its political structure. They appointed a dictator, an emergency magistrate with unchecked military power, for the first time in over a century. The man they chose was Quintus Fabius Maximus. Fabius was not interested in fighting Hannibal directly. He had looked at the evidence from Trebia and Trasimene, and he reached a conclusion that was politically unpopular but strategically sound. You could not beat Hannibal by meeting him in the kind of engagement he had prepared. The Roman military system, superior in pitched battle, powerful in sieges, effective in the long campaigns of attrition that had built the empire, had no answer for Hannibal's particular skill set. Fabius's answer was to simply not play. He shadowed Hannibal's army through central and southern Italy. He cut off foragers. He picked off isolated detachments. He denied battle. He used the Roman logistical network, the roads, the allied towns, the supply stockpiles, as a strategic weapon while refusing to commit to the kind of open-field confrontation Hannibal needed. The Romans called him cunctator, the delayer. They meant it as criticism. It was actually correct. But Hannibal had his own answer to Fabius. He was in enemy territory, living off what he could take. He needed Fabius to fight, or he needed to keep the Italian allies loyal to Rome, frightened enough to reconsider their commitments. He marched through Campania, some of Rome's richest agricultural land, burning everything. He waited for Fabius to descend from the hills. Fabius didn't come. In 216 BC, the political pressure became unsustainable. Roman allies were watching Carthaginian armies burn their fields while Roman legions did nothing. The Senate demanded action. Fabius's approach was politically untenable in a system where commanders were expected to fight and win. He was replaced. 2 consuls took command of the largest army Rome had yet assembled. somewhere between 70 and 80,000 infantry, plus cavalry. They would not wait. They would find Hannibal and crush him through sheer numerical force. They found him near a small town called Cannae. What happened at Cannae is described in most accounts as a military masterpiece. That is accurate, but incomplete. Cannae was a masterpiece. It was also a catastrophe so severe that it reshaped how Rome thought about everything: war, politics, alliances, identity. Understanding Cannae's aftermath is more important than understanding the battle itself, because the aftermath is where Rome's actual response to Hannibal begins. The numbers are genuinely staggering. In a single afternoon in August 216 BC, Rome lost somewhere between 50 and 70,000 soldiers, killed, captured, or unaccounted for. 2 consuls, one of whom died on the field. Dozens of senators, since senatorial families were required to serve in the cavalry. Multiple former consuls. The flower of Roman aristocracy in one afternoon. Polybius, writing a century later, describes the shock in terms that don't feel like historical exaggeration. Cities wept. The roads south were clogged with refugees. For a few days, it genuinely seemed possible that Rome itself might be in danger. And then Rome did something that surprised Hannibal. It didn't surrender. This was not expected. In the Greek world, which provided much of the framework through which ancient military theorists understood war, a defeat of this magnitude typically ended a conflict. A city that had just lost its army in a field battle was understood to have lost the war. It negotiated terms. It acknowledged the new reality. That was how the system worked. Rome said no. The Senate met in emergency session and made a series of decisions that look, in retrospect, like the foundation of Rome's eventual victory. The first was to declare that there would be no ransoming of prisoners. This was financially painful, but it sent an ideological signal. Rome did not acknowledge that the men captured at Cannae represented a transaction to be concluded. The war was continuing. The second was to raise new armies immediately. 2 new legions. Then more. Rome's manpower base, anchored in its citizen body and the extensive network of Italian allies, was enormous compared to anything Hannibal could call on. The losses at Cannae were catastrophic, but not irreplaceable. The third, and most strategically significant, was to return to Fabius's approach, now rebranded as the official strategy rather than the philosophy of a single cautious commander. No more pitched battles with Hannibal, harassment, attrition, and the systematic exploitation of Rome's advantages. Rome's advantages were real, even if they hadn't been decisive in the field. It had a navy that Carthage couldn't match in the western Mediterranean. It had an alliance network in Italy that, although shaken by Cannae, remained fundamentally intact. The Italian allies were not, with some exceptions, defecting to Hannibal. They were frightened and hedging their commitments, but they were not opening their gates. It had a system of supply that could sustain armies in the field indefinitely, and it had the ability to fight everywhere simultaneously, not just against Hannibal in Italy, but against Carthage in Iberia, in Sicily, wherever the war needed to be taken. Several Italian communities did defect after Cannae. The most significant was Capua, the second largest city in Italy, which opened negotiations with Hannibal and eventually entered an alliance with Carthage. Other Samnite communities followed. Hannibal also received the promise of alliance from Philip V of Macedon, creating the theoretical possibility of a 2-front war for Rome. But the defections didn't cascade as Hannibal had needed them to. His entire strategic plan rested on a particular theory: that Rome's empire in Italy was not a genuine political community, but a coalition held together by Roman military dominance, and that once the military dominance was shattered at the field level, the coalition would dissolve. Destroy the legions. Remove the fear. Watch the allies drift away. It didn't work because the theory was partly wrong. The Italian allies were calculating entities with their own interests. Many of them had genuine economic and political interests aligned with Rome. Some of them feared Carthage more than Rome. Others didn't trust the permanence of Hannibal's presence. He was impressive in battle, but he couldn't guarantee long-term security if Rome eventually recovered. Rome understood this dynamic and worked it. The key move was not military. It was political. Every city and community that remained loyal to Rome received visible proof of that loyalty's value. Roman ambassadors circulated through the Italian peninsula, reinforcing relationships, promising support, making the case that Hannibal's victories were tactical while Rome's position was structural. Capua illustrated the problem for Hannibal. The city had gone over to him after Cannae, expecting a decisive Carthaginian victory to follow quickly. Hannibal spent his second winter in Capua's comfortable accommodations, a decision later Roman historians described as a softening of his army's edge, though that analysis is probably simplified. What actually mattered was that the second year after Cannae did not bring the decisive moment. Rome refused battle. The Allied network held. Capua began to realize that it had made a bet, and the bet was not paying off. Rome's decision to besiege Capua, years later, methodically, without offering Hannibal the battle he needed to relieve it, was a demonstration of the Fabian approach at its most effective. Hannibal could march to Capua's relief. He couldn't force Rome to fight him in the open. He could threaten Rome itself. The famous Hannibal at the gates moment in 211 BC, when he marched his army to the very walls of the city. But he had no siege equipment, no support infrastructure, and no capacity to take Rome directly. He was using the threat as a diversion. It didn't work. Rome stripped enough men from the Capua, sieged to defend the city, refused to abandon Capua, and took the city anyway that year. Capua fell. Rome had demonstrated that it could outlast Hannibal's pressure in any specific theater. The message to the remaining Italian allies was clear. Being on Hannibal's side didn't actually protect you. By 214 BC, the war had entered a phase that neither side had designed. Hannibal had won the battles: Trebia, Trasimene, Cannae. 3 engagements in 2 years that, by any conventional military logic, should have ended the conflict. Each one a tactical masterpiece. Each one producing casualties that would have broken most states in the ancient world. And yet here he was, 6 years into a campaign in Italy, still marching through the same peninsula, still unable to deliver the decisive political blow. Rome had survived the battles. It had changed its approach. And now the war was revealing what happened when an irresistible tactical force met a political system that simply refused to be irresistible against. Stalemate is the wrong word, because stalemate implies symmetry. The situation wasn't symmetric. Hannibal was slowly losing, just not in a way that looked like losing on any given day. He won most of the smaller engagements he was drawn into. Roman commanders who got ambitious and tried to fight him in the open still suffered for it. There were smaller Roman defeats throughout the 200s and 10s. But winning small battles in Italy wasn't getting him closer to his strategic objective. His strategic objective had always been political. Force Rome to negotiate, break the Italian alliance system, reduce Rome from a dominant Mediterranean power to one of several competing states. That objective required not just military victory, but political consequence. And the political consequence wasn't following. The reasons are worth examining carefully, because they illuminate something important about how wars of this type actually end. Hannibal was fighting with the wrong instrument. He had an army, extraordinary, experienced, adaptable. But an army is a tool for winning battles and controlling territory. Winning battles and controlling territory can force political outcomes, but only under certain conditions. The enemy must be reachable. The enemy must have a center of gravity, a capital, a leadership structure, a key resource that can be threatened or destroyed. And the enemy must believe that the war is costing more than peace would cost. Rome's center of gravity was Rome itself, and Hannibal couldn't take it. He had no siege equipment, and even if he had, Rome was a city of several 100,000 people with enormous walls, a senate that showed no sign of wanting peace, and the full resources of its surviving empire available to defend it. He could march to the walls. He could not go through them. The Italian alliance system was the other potential lever. Fracture enough allies from Rome, and the logistical and manpower base that sustained Roman armies would collapse. But fracturing an alliance requires offering the defecting parties something better than what they currently had. Hannibal could offer protection against Rome in the short term, and a hypothetical place in a Carthage-dominated Mediterranean in the long term. Rome could offer what it had already demonstrated: that it survived catastrophes, that it protected its allies when it could, and that defecting to Hannibal came with the serious risk of being reconquered later without mercy. The math was increasingly obvious to the Italian communities. Hannibal was still here. He was not obviously losing, but he was also not obviously winning, and not obviously winning was not sufficient reason to abandon an existing relationship with a power that controlled the roads, the trade routes, and the institutions of Italian life. For Rome, the stalemate was not comfortable. The economic damage of Hannibal's prolonged presence in southern Italy was severe. He continued to live off the land, which meant he continued to burn fields, confiscate supplies, and disrupt the agricultural economy. The Roman treasury was under consistent strain from maintaining multiple armies across multiple theaters. Sicily, Spain, and eventually Macedonia all required attention and resources simultaneously. But Rome had something Hannibal didn't: the ability to fight the war in multiple places at once without those multiple fronts threatening the core. Spain became the crucial theater in ways that weren't immediately obvious. Hasdrubal, Hannibal's brother, had been left in command of Carthaginian forces in Iberia. His mission was to reinforce Hannibal, send men, money, supplies, and prevent Rome from building a base in the west. Two other Scipio brothers, Gnaeus and Publius, father of the man who would eventually end the war, commanded the Roman forces in Spain and fought Hasdrubal to a functional standstill throughout the 210s. They didn't win decisively, but they prevented the reinforcements Hannibal needed from reaching him. This was Rome's most effective answer to Hannibal's strategic problem. Not defeating him directly in Italy, where it remained dangerous to try, but ensuring he remained cut off. Hannibal's army was not replaced. The soldiers who died in Italy, and there were thousands despite winning most battles, were gone. Numidian cavalry couldn't be recruited in Italy. Iberian infantry couldn't be trained locally. The Gallic recruits he had picked up in northern Italy at the campaign's outset had been largely used up in the great battles of the early years. Each victory made the army slightly smaller. Each year of campaign made it slightly older. The army was an irreplaceable instrument that was being consumed by the very victories it won. This is the paradox at the heart of the Italian campaign. Hannibal's army was too effective to be defeated in battle, but not capable enough in its supporting dimensions, logistics, reinforcement, political leverage, to translate its battlefield effectiveness into strategic outcome. He was trapped by his own success. As long as he kept winning, Rome wouldn't negotiate. As long as Rome wouldn't negotiate, winning wasn't enough. And every year, the resources available to him narrowed a little more. In 212 BC, Hannibal took Tarentum. It was a significant capture. Tarentum, modern Taranto, was one of the great ports of southern Italy, with a harbor deep enough to serve as a serious naval base. If Hannibal could hold it, and Carthage could use it as a resupply point, the logistical equation of the campaign might shift. Here was finally what the Italian strategy had been building toward. A port, an anchor, a place where Carthaginian ships could connect the Italian army to the resources of the wider empire. Rome held the citadel. A Roman garrison, entrenched in the elevated portion of the city, refused to yield and maintained a blocking position that prevented Hannibal from using the harbor fully. Carthaginian ships couldn't enter past the citadel's position. The port was available in theory and unusable in practice. This pattern, winning the strategic objective but not quite completing it, would define the middle years of the campaign. The same year saw Capua under Roman high siege. Hannibal couldn't be everywhere. He moved to relieve Capua, attempted a feint toward Rome to draw the besieging forces off, and failed to break the siege. Capua fell in 211 BC. He won the battle at Herdania in 210 BC, destroying a Roman army in Apulia, more than 16,000 Roman dead by some accounts. Another impressive tactical victory, but the army he destroyed was replaced. The position in Apulia remained contested. The political situation in southern Italy didn't change. In 209 BC, Tarentum was retaken by a Roman force under Fabius. There's a story, possibly apocryphal, certainly ironic, that Fabius took the city through treachery rather than direct assault, exploiting a personal relationship between a Tarentine commander and a Roman officer. Whether or not the specific details are accurate, the broader point is real. Rome had developed the institutional patience and strategic flexibility to wait for opportunities, while Hannibal's deteriorating resource situation gave him fewer opportunities to exploit. The fall of Tarentum eliminated the only real prospect of a Carthaginian naval connection to the Italian campaign. From that point forward, Hannibal's army in Italy was a closed system. Whatever men and material it had were all it would have. No resupply from Carthage, no reinforcement from Iberia, no connection to the wider Barcid network. How do you sustain an army in that condition? You keep moving. Stationary armies consume local supplies and wear out their welcome. A moving army can always find the next valley, the next unplundered region, the next community willing to provision a force in exchange for not being burned. Hannibal kept his army in motion through the south and center of Italy for years, remaining in the field, undefeated, but also unable to fix anything permanently. The Numidian cavalry, his most decisive military asset in the early years, remained formidable but was slowly depleted. The Romans had been studying their own cavalry failures carefully. They had reformed their cavalry organization, begun recruiting Numidian defectors, and developed allied cavalry from Spain and Italy that was more effective than their original formations. The qualitative gap that had been decisive at Trebia and Cannae was narrowing, slowly but narrowing. Rome also began producing commanders who understood the terrain of the problem. The younger generation of Roman generals, who had grown up fighting Hannibal's army, were learning things that couldn't be taught in the abstract. They had seen what Hannibal did with flanks, with hidden forces, with manipulated engagements. They were beginning to design their own battles with more caution, holding reserves, protecting their flanks more carefully, not advancing impulsively even under pressure. There was also the matter of Carthage itself. Hannibal's relationship with the Carthaginian government was complicated from the beginning. He was a Barcid, a member of the Aut faction that had effectively governed Carthage's military affairs for a generation. But he was not universally beloved in Carthaginian domestic politics. The Hanno faction, rival to the Barcids, consistently questioned whether the Italian campaign was worth its cost. They argued that resources spent supporting Hannibal could be better used elsewhere. Defending North Africa, maintaining Sicily, securing the silver routes from Iberia. They were not wrong from a certain perspective. Carthage was fighting a world war, and Hannibal's Italian adventure, however brilliant, was consuming resources that could have been allocated differently. The question of whether to reinforce him or redirect support was genuinely contested in Carthaginian council chambers throughout the campaign. The answer Carthage gave, too often, was to not fully commit in either direction. Not enough reinforcement to make the Italian campaign decisive. Not enough withdrawal to free up resources for a coherent, alternative strategy. The halfway position, supporting Hannibal minimally while pursuing other objectives partially, was the worst of available options. In Spain, the death of both Scipio brothers in 211 BC had temporarily reversed Roman fortunes. But Rome sent a replacement. Publius Cornelius Scipio, the general's son, 24 years old and already a veteran of Cannae and Ticinus. He would prove to be something no Roman general had yet managed to be, Hannibal's match. In 209 BC, the younger Scipio did something that illustrated his understanding of the war's actual logic. He didn't march toward Hasdrubal's main Carthaginian army in Spain. He marched to New Carthage, the city his father's family had been fighting toward for years, the Carthaginian capital in Iberia, the hub of the entire Western Mediterranean strategy. He took it in a single day. The assault combined timing, local intelligence, and tactical surprise in a way that would have been familiar to Hannibal. Scipio had learned from his enemy, either directly or through the accumulated experience of Roman generals who had studied what worked and what didn't. The city's walls were partially defended. A section along the lagoon was typically undermanned at a certain tidal state. Scipio's forces entered through the lagoon at low tide, while a direct assault occupied the defenders. New Carthage fell with its treasury, its supply stockpiles, its shipyards, and its hostages, representatives of Spanish tribal allies held as security against their community's loyalty to Carthage. Scipio released the hostages. He treated the Iberian populations with conspicuous generosity. He was building a political network in Spain in exactly the way the Barcids had built one, and with exactly the weapons they had used: reliability, respect for local customs, personal relationships with tribal leaders. Within 2 years, the strategic balance in Spain had reversed. Hasdrubal recognized that the Iberian campaign was lost. he made a decision that was, in retrospect, the war's hinge point. He left Spain with the army that remained, crossed the Alps, retracing his brother's route, and marched into northern Italy to reinforce Hannibal. This was Hannibal's last real chance. If the two brothers could unite their forces in Italy, the qualitative military advantage might again outweigh Rome's numerical superiority. A combined Barcid army in Italy, properly coordinated, was something Rome might not be able to contain. Hasdrubal crossed the Alps in 207 BC and arrived in northern Italy. He sent messengers south to coordinate with Hannibal, to tell him where to meet, when to move. The messengers were captured. It was a piece of operational intelligence that changed the war. Rome now knew where Hasdrubal was, where he was going, and the rough timing of a proposed junction with Hannibal's army. The consul Gaius Claudius Nero was facing Hannibal in the south. His colleague Marcus Livius Salinator was facing Hasdrubal in the north. Nero made a decision that required both military boldness and absolute operational secrecy. He stripped 6,000 men from his army facing Hannibal, marched them north by night using roads away from the main routes, joined Livius's force before Hasdrubal realized what was happening, and met Hasdrubal at the Metaurus River. Hasdrubal's army was destroyed. Hasdrubal himself was killed. Hannibal learned about it when Roman soldiers threw his brother's head into his camp. The story is recorded in multiple ancient sources with variations in detail, but consistency in its basic shape. However the specific incident unfolded, the news itself was definitive. The reinforcement was not coming. The war in Spain was lost. Hasdrubal was gone. The plan that had been the campaign's underlying logic, the idea that a second Barcid army could enter Italy and together they could force a settlement, had just been closed. Hannibal withdrew to Bruttium, the toe of the Italian boot. He contracted the range of his operations, concentrated his force, and held his position. He was not defeated militarily. He was increasingly irrelevant. The war was moving away from him. Scipio in Spain was converting battlefield victories into political realities, bringing tribal confederacies across to Rome's side, preparing the infrastructure for a strike at Carthage itself. The Italian campaign, which had been the center of the strategic universe in 218, was now a sideshow. Hannibal sat in Bruttium with his undefeated army, waiting for a strategic picture to change in ways he could no longer influence. In 204 BC, Scipio landed in Africa. He had argued for it in the Senate for years. The logic was straightforward, but required a kind of strategic boldness that had been difficult to sell. The way to end the war in Italy was to take the war to Carthage. Force Carthage to recall Hannibal, fight him on ground where Rome's logistical advantages applied, end the conflict in Africa rather than chasing an undefeatable army around southern Italy for another decade. Fabius had opposed it. Many senators had. The proposal looked reckless, abandoning the containment of Hannibal, committing major forces to a trans-Mediterranean expedition, betting everything on a single strategic stroke. But Fabius was old, and his authority diminishing. Scipio's victories in Spain had given him the political capital to override objections. He got his command. He landed in North Africa with a force of about 25,000, a relatively small army given the objective. He established a base, began raiding Carthaginian territory, and built his relationships with Massinissa, the Numidian king whose cavalry would prove decisive in the final confrontation. He was doing in Africa what Hannibal had done in Italy, moving fast, living off enemy territory, building political relationships, keeping the initiative. Carthage panicked in exactly the way Rome had not. The difference was institutional. Rome had the Senate, the deep reserves of manpower, the century of structures built around surviving crisis. Carthage had a commercial oligarchy that had spent 15 years arguing about strategy and never fully committed to any of them. When a Roman army appeared on their doorstep, the argument collapsed. They recalled Hannibal. He had spent more than 15 years in Italy. He left from Brutium with the survivors of his army, men who had been with him since Spain in some cases, who had crossed the Alps, who had fought at Trebia and Trasimene and Cannae, and 100 smaller engagements, who had grown old in Italy. He sailed to North Africa, landing at Hadramautum in 203 BC. The Zama campaign that followed was not simple. Hannibal arrived in Africa and spent months rebuilding his force, integrating Italian veterans with local Carthaginian troops, trying to assemble something that could face Scipio's force. The negotiations between the two sides produced a face-to-face meeting, the famous conference between Hannibal and Scipio before the battle, recorded in Polybius and Livy with some variation. The details may be embellished, but the meeting itself was real. The two commanders talked and reached no agreement. The war would be decided in the field. The Battle of Zama in 202 BC was, strategically, the most important engagement of the entire war. And it was the only major engagement of the Hannibalic War where Hannibal lost. He deployed in his characteristic manner, infantry in the center, war elephants at the front, cavalry on the flanks. But the situation was inverted from everything he had controlled before. In Italy, he had had the superior cavalry. His Numidians had been devastating on the wings while his infantry held the center. At Zama, Scipio had Massiniss's Numidians, excellent cavalry that he had recruited through the political work of the previous 2 years. The Carthaginian cavalry on the flanks was weaker. Scipio had also spent the months before the battle studying every engagement Hannibal had fought. Every detail available to him he had absorbed. He knew what the elephant charge looked like. He arranged his infantry in lanes, open corridors between maniples, so the elephants would be channeled into the gaps and neutralized rather than devastating the Roman infantry formation. He had thought specifically about what Hannibal did and designed answers. The battle went as Scipio had prepared for. The elephants were disrupted. The Roman and allied infantry engaged. The Carthaginian cavalry broke and fled, pursued off the field. When it returned, as Scipio had anticipated and planned. It came back to find the Carthaginian infantry surrounded on 3 sides. Hannibal extracted himself. He escaped the field. He returned to Carthage and told the council of elders that they needed to make peace. This was, by the accounts we have, the first time in his life he publicly acknowledged that a military situation could not be resolved by fighting. The terms Rome imposed were severe. Carthage surrendered its navy, paid an enormous indemnity, gave up Spain and its remaining Mediterranean territories, agreed never to make war without Rome's permission. It was reduced from a rival power to a dependent client. The man who had designed the entire campaign, crossed the Alps, and kept an undefeated army in Italy for 15 years, was now a civilian in a city that had been effectively defeated. Rome won the Second Punic War. That fact can obscure something important. The Rome that won in 201 BC was a fundamentally different institution from the Rome that had marched to Trebia in 218. The transformation was not incidental. It was caused, specifically and directly, by what Hannibal had done to Roman military thinking over 17 years. The Roman legionary system that fought at Cannae was an instrument designed for the kind of war Rome had fought in the preceding centuries. Wars in the Italian peninsula and western Mediterranean, where disciplined infantry in close formation was the dominant element. The legion was powerful, flexible by ancient standards, and deeply effective in the role it had been designed for. But it had a fixed tactical vocabulary. It knew how to attack. It knew how to hold. It didn't know how to think about what was happening at the margins. Cannae taught it about margins. The encirclement at Cannae, where Hannibal's weaker center absorbed Roman pressure while his more powerful flanks folded inward and the cavalry completed the envelope from behind, was not a previously unknown concept. Double envelopment appears in military thinking across multiple ancient cultures, but executing it against a force significantly larger than your own, in a way that worked despite the enemy's numerical advantage, required a management of timing, psychology, and coordination that Roman generals had not demonstrated they could match. After Cannae, Roman military thinking specifically addressed the problem. Reserves began to be held back more consistently. The triarii had always been a reserve element, but the use of flanking reserves, cavalry coordination, and the concept of a held rear became more sophisticated. Roman cavalry was reorganized and supplemented with allied cavalry from across the Mediterranean, specifically to address the qualitative inferiority that Hannibal had exploited so consistently. Scipio's tactical innovations at Zama drew explicitly on what had been learned. The lane formations for the elephant charge, practically unique in Roman battle accounts, were a direct response to a specific Hannibalic weapon. The Numidian cavalry recruitment and its planned use as a returning enveloping force was a direct application of the lesson Trebia and Cannae had taught, now turned against the teacher. The strategic insights were even more significant than the tactical ones. The Fabian approach, systematic harassment, denial of pitched battle, exploitation of logistical advantage, fighting in every theater simultaneously, became the template for how Rome handled military powers it couldn't defeat directly. It was not a natural strategy for a culture built around aggressive military valor. It required overcoming deep political and cultural resistance. The fact that it prevailed against enormous internal opposition was itself a demonstration of how seriously Rome had learned from its failures. The Spanish campaigns also produced something that reoriented Roman military culture. The idea that strategic victory required not just battlefield dominance but political reconstruction, that allies had to be genuinely won rather than merely coerced, was applied by Scipio in Spain with a sophistication that hadn't characterized earlier Roman expansion. He released the Spanish hostages. He respected local customs. He built relationships with tribal leaders. He was, consciously or not, doing what Hannibal Barca had done a generation earlier. Rome was learning from Carthage by fighting Carthage. The senior officers who served under Scipio in Africa, many of whom were veterans of the Italian campaign who had spent years watching Hannibal operate, formed the nucleus of the next generation of Roman commanders. They brought with them specific memories of specific tactical problems and the solutions that had worked. The lessons weren't abstract. They were personal, carried in the bodies of men who had fled across Italian rivers or held desperate rearguard positions or learned the hard way that cavalry on both flanks was not a comfortable situation to be in. the Roman military system of the later Republic and early Empire, more flexible than the pre-Hannibalic model, more attentive to the full dimensions of a battlefield, more politically sophisticated in the management of conquered and allied populations, reflects, in part, an education conducted by a Carthaginian general who spent 17 years teaching Rome what it didn't know. Hannibal himself, after the peace, served as a civilian administrator in Carthage. He apparently had genuine ability in that role too. The ancient sources suggest he was effective at reforming Carthaginian finances and reducing the corruption in its government. Rome, watching nervously, eventually demanded his removal. He fled into exile, moved through the Hellenistic courts of the eastern Mediterranean, eventually found shelter with Prusias the First of Bithynia. He died around 183 BC, reportedly by his own hand, saying, or being attributed with saying, that he would not give Rome the satisfaction of deciding when he died. The authenticity of the last words is uncertain. The life behind them was real. There is a kind of history that measures victory by who held the field at the end. Rome held the field. Carthage was eventually destroyed utterly in 146 BC. The city leveled, its population enslaved or killed, its memory methodically suppressed. The Third Punic War, 50 years after Hannibal's campaign, finished what the Second had not. By any measurement of who won, Rome won. But there's another way to measure a war. Not by who survived, but by who changed. Hannibal's campaign against Rome lasted 17 years. In those 17 years, no Roman general defeated him in the field in Italy. He won every significant engagement he sought. He destroyed Roman armies with a consistency and creativity that has no parallel in the ancient world. He did it with a foreign force, in enemy territory, without a navy, without secure supply, without reinforcement, operating thousands of miles from his home base. And then he lost. He lost not because Rome was more brilliant, not because Roman generalship at the field level was his match for most of the war. He lost because his strategic theory was wrong about what would cause Rome to break. He lost because Carthage never fully committed to the campaign. He lost because Spain fell while Italy held. He lost because the war lasted long enough for Rome to learn, and Rome was an institution that converted learning into structure in ways that outlasted any individual crisis. But here is the irony that the Roman sources themselves couldn't quite suppress, even as they wrote the victory narrative. The Rome that won was, in crucial ways, the Rome that Hannibal had made. Its military flexibility, its strategic patience, its willingness to fight on multiple fronts simultaneously, its sophisticated management of allied relationships, its cavalry doctrines, its officer culture, shaped by a generation of men who had grown up fighting the best strategic mind of the ancient world. The enemy shaped the victor. The Roman officer corps, that destroyed Carthage, that conquered the Hellenistic East, that eventually built the Mediterranean Empire, fought with tools partly forged in the furnace of the Hannibalic War. Polybius, a Greek hostage taken to Rome, who became one of its most insightful historians, wrote that the Roman system's greatest quality was its ability to absorb catastrophe and continue. He was writing in the generation after Hannibal, and he knew what kind of catastrophes had been absorbed. Scipio Africanus understood this explicitly. There are accounts of him in later life expressing genuine admiration for Hannibal as a commander, placing him among the greatest generals in history. This wasn't false modesty or political performance. It was a professional recognition of what he had faced and what defeating that opponent had required. You don't become the kind of General Scipio became without understanding what you learned and who taught you. Hannibal's tragedy, if that is the right word for it, was not that he failed. It was that he succeeded completely at everything he could control, and the thing he couldn't control was the nature of the institution he was trying to break. He could destroy Roman armies. He could not destroy Roman persistence. He could win battles for 15 years in Italy. He could not win the political outcome that battles were supposed to produce. He came closer than anyone before him, or for centuries after, to breaking Rome at the height of its republican power. He redrew the map of what was militarily possible. He demonstrated tactical principles that military thinkers have studied for 2,000 years. He forced Rome to become something it wasn't before. In the end, Rome won. They wrote the history. They decided what was remembered and what was erased. But they remembered him. They kept remembering him. Roman fathers threatened disobedient children with his name. Roman generals studied his campaigns as templates. Roman historians returned to his battles again and again, trying to understand how a foreign commander had walked into the center of their world and held it, undefeated, for nearly 2 decades. You don't keep studying an enemy you've simply defeated. You keep studying the one who changed you. In defeating him, they became more like him.